Hi everyone, this is Matthew Janna for Card Runners, and I'm here with Out of Position Flop Play Part 1. The nightmare begins. The Out of Position Flop Play series will be the longest and hardest theory series I've done so far. I'm going to try very hard to present this stuff very clearly, to present it as easy as I can present it, and to still not leave out details which are really important. Just by the nature of the material we're going to cover, this is the hardest stuff to talk about. This stuff's very hard to model, as you'll see, and when you're just out of position, it just makes playing things very difficult. So it's not only difficult to talk about theoretically, even once you understand stuff theoretically for out of position flop play, it's pretty hard to implement. So just be aware, this is going to be a tough series. I do not know the exact order of videos, but expect at least several theory videos and Flopzilla-based videos. I might do some other stuff such as live play videos, but expect at least theory videos and Flopzilla-based videos. I'm going to work much harder at making sure my videos tie together neatly and are all related to one another. Unfortunately, I don't know exactly how many videos I'm making in this series yet, and I will try to make a big flowchart or list of the order I recommend people watch my videos. Usually, every time after I make a theory video especially, I get a bunch of PMs from people asking me what videos they should watch that are theory-based that lead into this new video, or what videos they should watch after it. I realize that there's not a clear order and you should watch the videos. I'm trying to fix that. I will eventually make a list or a flowchart that tells you what order to watch the videos in. That's not done yet. That's going to be something I work on and do as I make more videos. This is not a good starter series, so whatever flowchart or list I eventually end up making, this is going to be one of the most difficult series in it. Due to time constraints, I cannot release the videos in this series one right after another. So, since I'm trying to make a whole, complete set of videos that clearly lead into one another, I'm probably going to do something like an out-of-position flop play video, then a pre-flop video, then an out-of-position flop play video, then a pre-flop video. So you're both getting new content, and when people PM me asking about what other videos they should be watching, there will be the videos that they should be watching first, not just only new content that I'm making. So, just be aware, I'm probably not going to have all the out-of-position flop play series videos one right after another. There's going to be a decent time period between each one. As you will see, having more time between these videos is likely going to be helpful. It will give you more time to think about things before you just go watch the next video. So, why is out-of-position flop play so tough? Neither player has a polarized range. Most of the tough decisions and hard balancing problems occur on the flop. People only think the turn is the hardest street to play in poker because people play the flop so poorly. The flop is the hardest street to play by far. It is not anywhere near close. So when you're playing on the river, usually if you get to the river, someone has bet one or both of the previous streets, and it's pretty clear who has a polarized range, who's going to do the betting or the checking, and who's going to maybe call when they face a bet. So, for example, if your opponent bet the flop and the turn, you're not going to really donk bet the river. It's almost never going to make sense. You know your opponent has the polarized range. You know you're going to check to him. And he knows that you pretty much have a range of mostly bluff catchers, and you're going to call with him some of the time. On the flop, none of that has happened. Both players can have sets in their range. Both players can have, top pair, top kicker, over pairs, or two pairs in their range. Both players can usually have a bunch of gut shots, flush draws, 3 to a straight, 3 to a flush. Your ranges are both incredibly wide, and you both have almost all the different types of hands in your ranges. So it's extremely hard to know where to start because you have this wide range and nothing's really happened yet. Balanced betting ranges make double barreling and triple barreling very easy. So if you do bet on the flop, usually the following streets are much, much easier to play. And picking the right types of bluffs and using the right ratio of bluffs makes the following street even easier. So if you are balancing ranges well once you do bet on the flop, a lot of times you get almost like spoon-fed what you should be bluffing with on the turn or the river. On the turn, you're usually going to be bluffing with, the hands that have very little showdown value, but a good amount of equity. They can outdraw your opponent on the river. So maybe you turn to straight draw or turn to flush draw. And likewise, on the river, you're usually going to be bluffing with hands that have a really good removal effect, or hands that have very, no showdown value, so you want to use them as bluffs. Once again, on the flop, we don't have all of our bluffs nicely handed to us, usually. It's much more difficult to tell what to do. So this is probably the biggest reason for why it's so hard to play the flop out of position. In addition to that, there is a large amount of stack depth and several streets remaining. Theory usually starts solving on the last street. For example, we can find a flop raising ratio of value bets to bluffs by making sure we're balanced on the river. The further we get from a game that can be modeled easily, the more difficult applying theory becomes. I'm even going to go as far as to say it's not that hard to model the value of position when you're on the river. It's extremely hard to model it on the flop. So whenever you're modeling something, you're usually going to start, for poker at least, on the last street, and then you're going to work backwards. When we're dealing with the flop, we've worked backwards a lot. This is kind of why it's pretty much impossible to solve for an optimal opening frequency pre-flop. Like if someone said, Matt, what do you think the optimal cutoff opening percentage is? I probably wouldn't have that much of a better idea than just anyone that's played a whole lot of hands, because it's so difficult to solve that spot because we're so far from anything that can be modeled. This is what happens on the flop. We can model the river super, super easily. When we start talking about the turn, yeah, we're not that far from the river. We know what we're trying to do on the river, so we can kind of figure out what to do on the turn. When we're talking about the flop, now we're even further removed from the river, so our model's not giving us a super clear answer, so things get more difficult. So this is a huge problem for trying to figure out how to play the flop out of position. We are required to balance many ranges at once. We will often use a combination of check raising, check calling, and betting ranges. Having to balance 3 ranges at once is not easy. This is true both in theory and practice. It's quite difficult to balance multiple ranges at once. So now when I'm playing the flop out of position, I have to ask myself, okay, do I have a check raising range here? Do I have a check calling range here? How do I balance each one of those? Do I have a betting range? How do I balance that? I got to make sure I'm not check folding too much. If I bet and he raises me, what am I 3-bet? There's so many ranges I need to balance at once for playing the flop out of position. When I'm in position and I'm facing a bet, it's pretty easy to think like, oh, okay, I'm facing a bet, so I need to balance a raising range and a calling range. That's it. There are more ranges when I'm out of position. There's at least a check raising, check calling, and betting range. And even within, the betting range, you have to think about what you're 3-betting when you get raised. So quite difficult to balance all these ranges at once. The value of position is difficult to quantify and changes greatly based on the board texture. We're actually going to talk about this one specifically a lot in this video, so I'm not going to talk about it too much right now, but this further makes modeling out of position flop play very difficult. It's hard to say exactly how big of a deal position is, so it's harder to use models because models can't take position into account very well. And lastly, there's no simple starting point. When approaching out of position flop play, where do we even begin? When we were in position, we could kind of figure out starting points by saying, okay, if my opponent's betting, I don't think he should be able to bet any 2 cards here profitably, so I know I need to defend at least this much. When you're out of position, where do you even start? There's so much stuff that has to come together at once to have things make sense, and makes starting extremely difficult. So now it's time to start trying to actually figure this out, so where do we begin? How do we even begin to approach out of position flop play? How do we compare betting, check calling, and check raising? To be playing theoretically optimal, we must be taking the most plus EV line with every hand at every point. Make sure you really understand this and absorb this. This is one of those facts that most people tend to know, but they tend to forget about it when they're actually trying to figure out how to play their ranges. So they might think one type of hand plays really well as a check raise. Maybe they want to check raise a draw, but if you don't want to check raise any value hands, that's not going to overall work. And every single hand has to be taking the most plus EV line. You cannot just say, oh, well, I'll check call a set sometimes for balance reasons if it's more plus EV to bet the set or to check raise the set. You have to always be taking the most plus EV line to have a line theoretically make sense. Make sure you keep this in mind as we go through in this video. When we are in position, we know we must defend enough to prevent our opponent from being able to bet with any 2 cards on most board textures. Otherwise, he bluffs complete garbage, which seems very wrong on many textures. What about out of position? So when we're in position, there's not a lot of board textures where you're usually going to think, yeah, I think my opponent should be betting any 2 cards here profitably. Because if that is the case, especially if they cold called from the blinds, they'll be donk betting with like under pairs with just complete garbage hands. And usually if you have the advantage of being in position, and if you used a balanced flatting range, you're going to be able to defend pretty effectively in position because position is just a huge advantage. So he should be losing money if he uses 2 worse of bluffs. There are exceptions to this. If the opponent hits the flop much better than you, and if it's a board texture, which it's not a big deal to be in position, we'll talk about those later. But for the most part, if your opponent's betting any 2 cards profitably, you're probably doing something wrong on a lot of board textures, so that gives you a really, really good starting point. We do not get this starting point when we're out of position. People have asked me about this many times in the forums, and I've always said I don't want to talk about it, because we're going to talk about it in this video, but we will talk about how profitable your opponent's bluff should be in position rather than out of position, something we haven't done yet. So now on to that very key question. Should the player in position be able to bet any 2 cards profitably? In order to prevent the player in position from being able to bet any two cards profitably for 0.75 pot size bets, we must defend around 60% of our checks. That is a lot of checks we're defending. In position, it was quite easy to defend this much. Out of position, it is much more difficult for several reasons. So I've already shown in other videos how it's really not that hard to defend 60% of your checks in position. There's a lot of, 3 to a straight, 3 to a flush hands that are going to work very well. When we do have a raising range on the flop, we're allowed a whole lot of bluffs for every one value combo we raise. It's really not that difficult. Out of position, it's much, much harder to do. The first reason is we are out of position, which lowers the EV of our range significantly. Position is a huge deal. How important position is will matter based on the board texture, but if you have two ranges that are exactly the same, and one player is in position and one player is out of position, and there's 3 streets left where the same player is always going to be in position, then that player who's in position has a pretty huge advantage. We can't quantify the exact EV, and it is going to change based on the board texture and the ranges, but for the most part, it's a pretty big deal. It helps his range a really, really lot. We have also checked, which signals weakness when we check out of position. Betting ranges are stronger than checking ranges. We expect the average hand in our range, which does not put money in the pot, to be weaker than the range which does put money in the pot. So of course you are sometimes going to bet very weak hands as bluffs, and you're going to check with some very strong hands to be a trickster. But for the most part, your betting range is pretty much always going to be stronger than your checking range, right? The person that's doing the betting has the better range, or at least the more polarized range, but overall, it's a safe thing to pretty much say, when you check, you signal weakness. When you bet, you signal strength. So by checking on the flop, you have said, I have a hand that's in my overall weaker range. It doesn't mean your hand is necessarily weak, but you have a hand that's in your overall weaker range if you have both a betting range and a checking range, and you decided to check. Obviously, it's pretty easy to see how you'd have a lot of problems if you checked with a very strong range. In the case of blind defense, we may have been calling with a weak range due to dead money. Getting a 1 pot size bet discount on a 2.5 to 3 big blind open is a pretty big deal. So we should be calling hands just trying to lose less than 1 big blind. This is something people often forget, but it's not something that you can because this happens a large fraction of the time. A lot of the times when you find yourself out of position, if you're playing theoretically well, it's going to be, well, I was in the big blind and the button or the cutoff opened, so I got a huge discount and the button's range sucks. Something like that. So you're going to be calling really wide out of the big blind because you got that discount, but you're also still expecting to overall lose money on the hand. I call in the big blind all the time when I expect to still lose 0.8 big blinds on the hand because that's less than 1. So I'm still calling. Since I'm calling with the overall much weaker range because I got that big discount, it of course makes sense that I would check fold more. I'm just trying to lose less than 1 big blind, so if I can lose 0.8 big blinds by picking a strategy which requires me to call pre-flop, but check fold a lot of flops, that's still an improvement. So keep that in mind that these are 3 pretty big reasons which are strongly suggesting, yeah, that whole defending 60% of our check thing, likely not going to happen on a lot of boards and a lot of positions. This cannot be solved directly. This is going to be the story of our lives for the next 8 videos or however many out of position flop play videos I make. We cannot usually solve for stuff directly here because all the stuff that we can solve for directly usually uses like really basic pre-flop math, or we're on the river and we can get very clear answers on the river. We don't have either one of those things here. We're very far away from the river, and most of the math we're going to be doing isn't going to be very simple math like pre-flop math, so we can't solve for stuff directly. We have to just keep these concepts in mind as we try to figure out how do we get towards an equilibrium which looks like we're playing correctly and our opponent's playing correctly. That's what we're going to do. So what determines how many checks we can defend? We can defend many more checks on some board textures than others. While all the usual variables apply, stack depth, streets left to act, etc., 2 are especially key. So we're not going to name all the variables that are relevant here. We're just going to name the main 2. Whose range connected harder? That's a pretty big one. This one is pretty obvious, but doesn't make it any less important. You have to know whose range connected harder and how valuable value hands bluffs are on that specific board texture. Play around with Flopzilla, play around with whatever program you have that you want to use. You need to get a good sense for what range hit harder. If you don't know how often a board texture hits your opponent's range, you're pretty much going to be guessing, and you're not going to know how to effectively play a lot of hands in your range. The one we're mostly going to focus on today is how valuable being in position is for a given board texture. This one is new. On some board textures, being in position is a big deal, such as a Jack 9-7 board with 2 diamonds for a flush draw. On others, it matters much less, such as King 2-2 rainbow boards. Why? That's what we're going to be talking about. So just to make it incredibly clear to any of the sort of newer players that are watching this, I'm not saying number 1 here isn't extremely important, but this is something that you can find in other videos. This is stuff you can probably figure out on your own by just randomly generating flops, looking at cold calling ranges, looking at opening ranges. So that's not what we're going to be focusing on in this video. It's still extremely important and you have to learn it, just not what we're going to be focused on right now. So, how valuable is being in position on this board? We are going to be asking ourselves that question many times. We are going to ask this question so many times in this series that if you make a drinking game of it, you will die.
Yeah, baby!
There is no quick one-size-fits-all rule for how valuable being in position is. There are too many variables which need to be taken into account to even make an effective model. Yet there is a really, really good starting point. And we're going to go there right now. Perfectly polarized ranges and position. If one player has a perfectly polarized range on the flop, 100% equity and 0% equity, does it matter if he is in or out of position? No, it does not. But why? So think for a moment and really make sure you understand why if one player has a perfectly polarized range, meaning they have either the pure nuts, 100% equity hand, or pure air, why does it not matter whether or not he's in position? Well, the reason for that is he will always bet every street that his opponent is indifferent to calling. If he bets one pot-size bet on each street, he needs to have value 66.7% of the time on the river, 44.5% of the time on the turn, and 26.6% of the time on the flop. All this math is discussed in other videos. We're not going to go over why that math works out, but you should at least be comfortable with the fact that on the river when you're betting, you mostly need to have value. Here you're giving your opponent 2-to-1 odds, so you have to have a value hand 2 times for every time you have a bluff, so that means you have to have 66.7% of your bets be for value on the river. Then as you go to earlier streets, you're allowed to be bluffing more. As I said, this is in other videos. The player with a perfectly polarized range will always bet with this ratio of value bets and bluffs for one pot-size bet. The player with the bluff-catching range will always check. Position doesn't matter at all. So the whole point of a model is to take a very complex situation or problem and to make a couple assumptions which allow you to easier run calculations and visualize it. That's what we did here. So we did this in other videos where we said, okay, let's start off imagining we have a perfectly polarized range. How much should we be bluffing on the flop, turn, or river if we have a perfectly polarized range? The cool thing about that model is we didn't actually have to make any more assumptions to get exactly correct answers. So if a player is betting with a perfectly polarized range, and he can only bet one pot-size bet, he will have this frequency of value bets or bluffs on every single street, regardless of whether he's in or out of position. The person who has the bluff-catching range will always check. A bet never accomplishes anything from that person. Because if he bets and the opponent has a value hand, he's just going to lose more money. If he bets and the opponent has a bluff, he didn't need to bet to make that bluff fold. He already had the best hand and could win the pot on the river. So, with perfectly polarized ranges, what you need to take out of this is, with perfectly polarized ranges, position does not matter. Ignore the frequencies for betting ranges here. That's not important. Just make sure you get that take-home point. For a perfectly polarized range, position does not matter at all. Perfectly polarized ranges on the flop. There is no such thing as a perfectly polarized range on the flop, since a betting range will never have 100% or 0% equity. Yet there are some board textures where a betting range will play much more closely to a perfectly polarized range than others. What are they? Stop and think. This series is not going to be hugely helpful if you have a tell me the answer or tell me the ratio attitude, since they often don't exist. Really pause and think. If you are completely wrong here, it will help if you pause and think and write down the wrong answer, because then you will remember this better. You will remember being wrong, and you'll remember why you were wrong, so you'll fix more leaks. So stop for a moment and think. And the answer is King 2-2 rainbow, Ace 6-2 rainbow, King 4 rainbow, Queen 7-3 rainbow, Ace 5-7 rainbow. So these are 5 board textures that I pretty much randomly made. These aren't the only dry board textures, of course. But what pattern do you notice? On dry boards with at least a single high card, betting ranges will play much closer to perfectly polarized, and position matters less. So think about this for a second. On the King 2-2 rainbow board, if you are betting or facing a bet, is it all that likely that a value bet's going to be outdrawn? And is it all that likely that a bluff is going to outdraw, a hand that has it beat? No. If you're betting on this board with ace-king, you pretty much are going to win on the river if you have the best hand on the flop. If you're betting with this board with, 6-5 suited, if your opponent has you beat, it's pretty unlikely you're going to outdraw him. Maybe you rarely runner a boat or runner a flush, but pretty unlikely. It's playing close to perfectly polarized. Same for ace-6-2 rainbow. If you're betting this flop for value, you have a hand like ace-king or ace-queen, how likely are you to be outdrawn? Not that likely. If you're bluffing, how likely are you to outdraw your opponent? Not that likely. Here you might have some 3 to a straight, 3 to a flush fun stuff like 7-8 suited, but for the most part, you don't have all that many of those. And even 7-8 suited, it does have a pretty good chance to run a runner, a straight, or a flush, but still, it's not that great of a shot. It's not as great as like overcards or something. So these boards, they are not boards where ranges are going to play exactly like they're perfectly polarized. A betting range will not be perfectly polarized, but it will be pretty close. From your own experience, are these the boards that are very hard to play out of position? They shouldn't be. So just another sort of fun fact to sort of tickle your brain right now. We'll talk about this more in future videos. But these also are the board textures where it's not that hard to play out of position. Position kind of matters less here, and you probably feel more comfortable check calling. So let's take this ace-6-2 rainbow board, for example. This is a board texture where all the time I'm going to check call with ace-x hands, pocket kings, pocket queens, pocket jacks, and I'm going to feel fine about it. Because I'm going to say to myself, well, even though I'm out of position here, this board isn't a board where it's that big of a deal to be in position compared to other boards. And if I'm check calling this flop with a hand like pocket kings, I'm not that afraid of free cards. So my opponent's not going to be able to really abuse, the free cards or, really manipulate the pot that well. So these are usually the same board textures where if you are out of position, yeah, of course you'd rather be in position, but being out of position is not that bad. Whereas on other board textures, as we'll talk about on the next few slides, it's just disastrous to be out of position. So there we go for our quick start. So now we're off to the other end of the spectrum. So we've established perfectly polarized ranges don't care at all about position. Now let's visualize board textures where the opposite is true, where value betting hands are very likely to be outdrawn and bluffs are very likely to improve. What boards play this way? So this one's really easy. So all I'm asking is, on what board textures are your value hands going to have less equity and your bluffs have more equity? List some of those board textures, because if you get something wrong, and there is a few tricky things in here, but if you get something wrong, you will remember it better. So what board textures play the opposite of the last board textures, where now our value hands have much less equity and our bluffs much more? Jack of hearts, 10 of hearts, 7 of clubs, 6 of diamonds, 7 of diamonds, 4 of spades, Queen of hearts, Jack of diamonds, 9 of clubs, etc. All these board textures, you're going to see the worst hand draw out all the time. How big of a deal is being in position on these boards? It is a massive advantage. A really, really big one. The general rule is the more equity bluffs have and the less equity value bets have, the more the player in position is favored. Rolling with the rule. Position is, of course, much more complicated than that rule, but it is an excellent starting point. Start writing down different board textures or randomly generating them with a program and see if you can find boards where you disagree. Okay, so there's always some problem with general rules. If you make them too general, they're not all that useful. And if you make them too specific, they're useful, but you can't apply them very often. This is a rule that I actually feel really, really good about, and I haven't heard anyone else talk about. So it's a rule that, yeah, it's not always going to work perfectly. You still need to be aware of all the other variables that are affecting, each player's range and what's going on. But for the most part, the closer a betting range is going to play to a perfectly polarized range, then the less position is going to matter. We've already talked about how if the range is literally perfectly polarized, it doesn't matter if it's in or out of position. The further you get away from a perfectly polarized range and the more equity bluffs have, then that's when position starts to be a really, really big deal. So I'm sure if you think really hard, you might be able to come up with a board texture where you think there's an exception to this rule. But for the most part, if you randomly generate some right now, you're probably going to see, yeah, pretty much all the board textures that follow that rule, those are the board textures that I just hate being out of position on. I am aware you probably have a lot of questions right now regarding board textures, which will eventually get answered, but we need to start somewhere. So this is a really good starting point. I know you got a lot of questions. We'll get to them. Note the rule does not say it is easy to play dry board textures out of position. This is probably the easiest way to get confused here, and this is far from what I'm saying. 2 of clubs, 7 of spades, 4 of diamonds is a very dry board. Yet value betting hands, jacks to 8s, are very likely to be outdrawn, and bluffs such as king-jack are very likely to improve to the best hand. This is a board texture where position is valuable despite it being considered a very dry board. Thinking in terms of dry board textures was a huge mental block for me, and it probably is for you too. King 7-2 rainbow is nothing like 7-3-3 despite them both being dry. The latter is a very hard board to play out of position with ranges of equal strength. Okay, so if you go look at some of my old videos right now, the ones that haven't been updated that are from like 2009, you're probably going to see me talk about dry board textures a lot before I had a really good grasp of how pretty much the term dry board texture isn't very useful. It's something that people use a lot when they use it incorrectly, myself included, because there is something very different between a board texture that's like King 7-2 rainbow and 7-3-3 rainbow. King 7-2 rainbow, when I check call with pocket queens, pocket jacks, king X on that board, those hands are not getting outdrawn. When I check call with hands that want to check call on a 7-3-3 board, the hands that maybe only want to let, 1 or 2 streets of betting in, really don't want to get raised, hands like 8s or 9s, those hands hate giving free cards. On a 7-3-3 board, if I'm bluffing, I'm going to outdraw my opponent a lot. Not going to happen very often on the King 7-2 rainbow board. So, there's a huge difference between different dry boards. So much to the point you're probably almost never going to hear me use the term dry again. If I do use it, it's probably at a point where I shouldn't be using it and I'm just doing it out of habit. But don't think in terms of dry boards, because there's dry boards that favor the person in position very much. There's dry boards where being in position is just not a very big deal. So one thing I'm probably going to use, which one of my students, Nick Howard, coined, so I'll give him credit for that, is King 7-2 rainbow, we're going to call a locked board. That's just the term that people have started using when I talk about it. Locked board means the hands that are check calling aren't very afraid of giving free cards, and usually it's on these locked boards that the person in position is not as heavily favored as he usually will be. So, we're going to talk about this a lot more in future videos, but just get used to seeing a locked board now, and notice how there's a difference between a dry board like 2-2-3 rainbow and a locked board like King 7-2 rainbow. The locked boards are the boards where the person in position is not heavily favored, whereas the very low dry boards, usually being in position, is very, very useful, because on those very low dry boards, a lot of bluffs can improve and a lot of value hands can get outdrawn. So let's randomly generate some boards. This is my favorite part of videos usually. We'll use Flopzilla to generate some boards. We're not going to talk about pre-flop ranges. We're just going to discuss if being in position is a big deal usually on that board texture. So this is very informal. We will go over extremely detailed and precise stuff with board textures later on. Right now, we're just getting a basic idea for, hey, is this a board where we should feel like position's a big deal? Bonus fact. Boards which have a high second pair card are usually quite easy to check call and allow us to play out of position very effectively. We will talk about why this is in a later video, but be aware of it now. So it's easy to check call Queen X on King Queen 4, hard to check call 7X on King 7-4. Nothing too shocking there, but something important to realize. There are some boards where it's going to be pretty easy to check call, and then that probably makes being in position less valuable than it might be on other board textures. Alright, so one of these gets outdrawn a bunch, one of the middle pairs here, one does not. So let's randomly generate flops, go, 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 go. Alright, so very simple stuff here. We're just going to randomly generate some boards, as I said. So let's look at this one. Ace 9-3. So, think for a second. Is this a board where the person in position is heavily favored? No, not at all. It's not that... I mean, it's still useful to be in position here, but it's not that big of a deal. It's going to play much closer to a perfectly polarized range. King 10-2. Alright, let's look at this one. This one's more towards the middle. Being in position is still going to be pretty useful here. You're going to be able to play your draws a lot more effectively. There's a lot of gut shots, flush draws, open-ended straight draws, all that fun stuff. But depending on the positions, it might be kind of easy for the out-of-position player to check call some 10x. Check calling 10x still isn't ideal. A lot of overcards can come. But it's a reasonable hand that can check call. And you still can check call with like some very, some king rag hands should be check called here, depending on how many you have in your range and all that kind of stuff. So this is a board where, yeah, it does help to be in position, but it's pretty reasonable to check call with some king X, pocket queens, pocket jacks, 10x, and all that other type of stuff. So position's useful here, but it's not as useful as it can be on some other boards. King Jack 2, pretty much the exact same deal as what we just talked about. King 5, King 4, 3. This one, I don't think it's that big of a deal to be in position. It's pretty easy to check call with like some king X, pocket queens, pocket jacks, pocket 10 type hands. And then the pair of 4s and pair of 3s, they're not usually all that relevant. They do make some pretty good bluffs, but I don't think position's a huge deal here. Oh, and then we get this one. So 10, 9, 8 with a flush draw. This board being in position is just such an incredibly huge deal. I mean, pretty much anyone that's played any reasonable amount of cards, even if they don't have a very good understanding of poker at all, they know this board just completely sucks to be out of position on. It follows our rule very clearly. We can see it's really hard to be value betting here with a super high equity hand. Even sets don't have a whole ton of equity here. And then it's very difficult to, it's just very difficult to get value with value betting hands when you're out of position. So being in position here is just awesome. It's very easy to call and then play the turn and the river cards extremely effectively. So this is pretty much as extreme as you can get, where just being in position here is just a huge deal. So if I were out of position and I got a flop that looked like this, if I'm check folding a super high frequency here, doesn't really bother me. I just say to myself, hey, he got really lucky to get a flop where being in position is just that awesome. 9-4-2. This is a board where being in position is going to be a pretty big deal. It's hard to check call on this board out of position because the hands that usually want to check call, like let's say maybe some 9x, pocket 8s, pocket 7 hands, those hands are very afraid to give free cards as well, which causes a bunch of problems with check calling. And also, yeah, a lot of bluffs are going to improve here. You're just very far from a polarized range. Strong hands, the best hand on the flop, whether it's like 9x, pocket 10s, pocket 8s, pocket 7s, that hand's going to be outdrawn all the time. Likewise, if you're bluffing on this board with ace-queen and your opponent calls you with pocket 8s, you're going to outdraw him all of the time. So using that rule, and you'll see when we go into more detail, this is a board texture where, yeah, I want to be in position probably a lot more than people think. People would probably think this board is like, it's reasonably dry. 9-4-2 is kind of dryish. I mean, there's a flush draw, but for the most part, it's reasonably dry. Yeah, and that's why you don't really stick with the dry rule. It doesn't work that well. Being in position here, I think, is a really, really big help. 8-6-5, nightmare to be out of position on this board. So pretty much almost any board you can randomly generate follows the rule really well. I'm very careful about sort of using general rules now because there's just all these little exceptions, and in the long run they might do more harm than good. This rule I feel pretty good about. It's a rule that just pretty much mostly works. You have to be aware there's so much other stuff to take into account, but it's extremely helpful. So yeah, here, you don't want to be out of position. It is not fun to play this board out of position. Ace, Queen, 9. And see, now this looks like a board where if I would have looked at this board a year ago, I would have been like, oh, this board's probably bad to be out of position. It looks coordinated-ish. But it's really not hard to play this board out of position. There's a lot of ace-rag that can check call, a lot of queen-x that can check call, and if you're value betting a hand like ace-king or ace-queen or, ace-9 or pocket 9s, it's just really hard for those hands to be outdrawn. So it's a board where being out of position, not that bad. There's a lot of hands we can check call with. A lot of our betting range is playing, closer, perfectly polarized than it will in most other spots. Let's do one or two more. Jack 4-2. This one looks like it's not that bad to be out of position. Maybe this one's closer towards the middle, but you can check call with some jacks, some 10s, some 9s. Not ideal. Those hands will still be outdrawn, but not a terrible board to be out of position on either. Ace Jack 4. Not that bad to be out of position. A lot of ace rag can check call, jack X, pocket kings, all that kind of stuff. Can usually check call here reasonably comfortable, and if you are betting on this hand, you're not going to be outdrawn all that often. Yeah, you'll still be outdrawn by some gutters, some flush draws, but for the most part, it's not like you're value betting pocket 8s on a 7-high board. When you're value betting ace king here or ace 4 here, for the most part, you're not going to be outdrawn all that often. Back to the original question. How many checks do we defend? On board textures which greatly favor the player in position, we're going to be check folding a lot. We cannot come close to defending the 60% of hands we need to in order to prevent the opponent from being able to bet any 2 cards. So one question I already can see that I'm probably going to get asked is, how often do I think once a player out of position checks, they're check folding enough that their opponent can properly bet any 2 cards? I have no idea what the exact frequency is, but I would say the majority of the time when you're checking out of position, your opponent probably is going to be able to bet any 2 cards. Not all the time, but most of the time. And even when you are check folding and your opponent can bet any 2 cards, there's a big difference between when you're check folding 50% of the time, after you check when you're folding 50% of the time when you face a bet, or after you check if you're folding 60% of the time. There's a big difference between those two, as we're going to talk about right here. But first, this sounds much worse than it is. Nothing really magical happens when we prevent our opponent from being able to profitably bluff. What if we do let him bluff any 2 cards profitably, but he only makes on average 0.4 big blind per bluff after he risked 3 big blinds to see a flop? Do we even care? Now really think about this for a moment, because this is a leak, it's a mental leak that a lot of players tend to have. And I see this all the time on the forums where people will think, I have to make my opponent indifferent, when making your opponent indifferent isn't that big of a deal. So, for example, let's say we decide that we are check folding at a frequency that after we check, our opponent makes 0.4 BBs once he bluffs. That's only a little bit different than if we check fold at a frequency where he makes 0.2 BBs per bluff. And that's only a little bit different than if we check fold at a frequency where he makes 0 BBs per bluff. Nothing really significant happens when you go from 0.2 to 0. Like, people will probably mentally think 0's a really, really big deal when it isn't. It doesn't really change almost anything there. Your opponent's still going to check some hands and bet some hands, whether or not his EV of his bluff is 0 or 0.2 or 0.4. Remember, just because your opponent can bet any 2 cards profitably does not mean he starts betting any 2 cards in position. This is especially true in position because when he checks back, he gets to see a free card and he'll have an easier time getting to showdown. Out of position, when your opponent can bet any 2 cards out of position, that was really just super useful for signaling we're probably doing something wrong, because it just seems so far-fetched for your opponent to be able to bluff a complete garbage hand out of position when you haven't shown any weakness. But keep that in mind. Do not start thinking just because your opponent can make a profitable bluff in position that it is for some reason a really big deal, because going from 0.4 BBs in EV when you bluff any 2 cards to 0.2 to 0, not that big of a deal at each step. I would say the most common spot where you really see people have this mental leak is when people are talking about betting the turn when their opponent can have a lot of draws. It's pretty common that you read in the forums someone say, you have to make your turn bet really big here, because if you make your turn bet small, your opponent can profitably call with his flush draws. Nothing significant happens when you make your opponent unable to profitably call with his flush draws. I'm of course oversimplifying things right now, but just think about this for a second. A lot of times people will try to make their bet size so big on the turn because they say, well, if I bet smaller, my opponent can profitably call with his flush draws. But if your opponent is making a plus 2 BB EV call with his flush draw, who cares? It's still good to bet, even though your opponent can profitably call, because his call is only super slightly profitable. So if you check, your opponent gets a super profitable bluff or a super profitable check back with his flush draw. So checking might be pretty bad there. But if you bet, your opponent only gets a super slightly profitable call. Not a big deal if you want to make your sizing so big that your opponent goes from having a plus 2 BB EV call to a 0 BB EV call. Nothing significant happened at making the profitability of his call with his flush draws 0. And by the way, I realize that there's different quality of flush draws, and that if you expect your opponent to always fold his flush draw, then when he calls some, he'll get paid off tremendously. So I realize it's a more complex and dynamic thing than this. I'm simply trying to state that a lot of times people assign a very, very big significance to making your opponent indifferent when that need to make your opponent indifferent just isn't there. It doesn't actually accomplish anything significant. So, how bad is letting the opponent profitably bluff with any 2 cards? Usually, when the opponent can make a profitable bluff with any 2 cards, he is required to have previously taken a risk. For example, if he can c-bet any 2 cards on the flop after 3-betting, this isn't likely a problem. It is a problem if he can profitably raise the flop with any 2 cards. If he could, he'll never fold to a bet. So this is just illustrating you have to be able to understand when is it okay for your opponent to maybe be able to bluff with any 2 cards profitably. If your opponent's 3-betting very aggressively from the blinds and you're flatting a lot of the time in the button, then if he makes a really slightly profitable flop bet, not that big of a deal because he's still overall losing money on the hand. If your opponent can profitably raise any 2 cards on the flop once you bet, then that is a really big deal because your opponent will never fold anything because he'll always just raise all of his air. So then that tells you, wait a second, if your opponent can raise any 2 cards profitably here, you have to be making a pretty big mistake. And by mistake, we're of course talking in theory. It is usually only a problem if our opponent gets to make a highly profitable bluff at a high frequency. Frequently getting to make a slightly profitable bluff isn't that big a deal. Rarely getting to make a very profitable bluff isn't that big a deal. So it's usually only a really bad thing if your opponent's getting to make a very profitable bluff at a very high frequency. You can kind of choose one or the other and you'll usually be okay. Either let your opponent make a really profitable bluff, but don't give him the opportunity to bluff very often. Or let him have many, many opportunities to make profitable bluffs, but the profitability of the bluffs is only very, very small. It's not a big deal. Let's quickly imagine two types of players. The first player does not bet very frequently on the flop, so he checks to his opponent a lot, and the opponent gets a lot of opportunities to make a slightly profitable bet. The other player c-bets the flop a ton, so the opponent does not get many profitable bluff opportunities on the flop, but since he's betting all of his strong hands, he's betting all of his good bluffs, he's not really check-calling with the hands he should be check-calling with. Once he does check, the opponent can bet any two cards and gets to make a very, very profitable bluff. In reality, I'm guessing most of the people that are watching this video right now are playing the second way, because that's just how most people are playing right now, which is they c-bet way too much, so once they check, they're check-folding way too much. It's much better in theory to play like a player who does not c-bet recklessly out of position on the flop and is much better at defending his checks. That's simply a much harder way to play, but it's much more effective, especially against other good players. So let's examine the frequently slightly plus EV flop bet a bit more. Imagine you raise to 3.25 big blinds pre-flop and only defend 50% of your checks on the flop to a 0.75 pot size bet. Your opponent thinks this is not theoretically correct and decides to start flatting you very wide. When you check on the flop and your opponent bets garbage, so a zero equity hand, what is his EV? Pause for a moment and think. This is a very simple calculation. If you do it wrong, it's good to realize why you did it wrong. So when you check here, what is your opponent's EV when he makes a 75% pot size bet? Well, the pot's going to be 8 BB. 3.25 times 2 is 6.5. Add in the blinds, 8 BB. And he wins that half the time when he bets. And likewise, you're going to defend half your checks, so he loses 6 blinds half the time. The average he wins when he bets is 1 BB. So every time you check to him, he gets 1 BB on average. What is the overall EV of the hand for your opponent after you check to him and he flops garbage? And by the way, when I said your opponent gets 1 BB on average when you check to him, I mean when he has a garbage hand. Obviously, if he has a good hand, he gets way more than that. So, what is the overall EV of the hand for your opponent after you check to him and he flops garbage? So now we're looking at the overall EV of his hand. This 1 BB right here that he wins once you check to him, that's his EV counting all the money he's already invested as dead money. That's not the EV of his entire hand. So, for example, if you pour a ton of money into the pot on the flop and the turn, and you only get to make a slightly plus EV river bet, you're overall still expected to lose a lot of money on the hand. You might win money once you get to the river, but you're overall expecting to lose money on the hand. This is a very, very important thing to understand, because you usually make all your decisions imagining all the money as dead money. And that's true. Once the money's in the pot, it is dead money. You should make your decisions based off examining all the money as dead money. But that's not what I'm asking here. I'm saying if you check to your opponent and he does get to make a bet, what is his overall EV for the hand? Because that will let us know if this seems reasonable in theory. If he's overall making a lot of money with the hand when he flops garbage, we know something's wrong. So what is his overall EV? Well, since he invested 3.25 pre-flop and then he won 1 post-flop, he overall loses 2.25 BBs with the hand when he flops garbage and you check to him. The opponent still loses money overall for the hand when he calls with hands too weak to theoretically call with pre-flop. Nothing suggests we are being exploited, and if our opponent is calling with hands which won't flop well reasonably often, he'll lose money. This is really important to understand. So even if my opponent thinks, hey, I can call pretty wide pre-flop because Matt checks the flop a lot, and once he checks, I can make a profitable bet with any 2 cards, he's still overall losing money for the hand unless he's going to flop good hands reasonably often because, yeah, you get a profitable bluff spot, but you paid too much money to get that possible bluff opportunity. All of this seems logical and makes sense with all the other theory we know. So we didn't prove any frequencies here. We're just kind of showing, hey, that whole once you check out of position on the flop and your opponent can bet any 2 cards profitably, this seems like it makes sense from every other aspect of theory we know. Everything seems reasonable, and I don't see either player having an incentive to change their strategy. calculating the EV of flopped air and bet air. We must understand the difference between the EV of flopped air and the EV of betting air. The EV of flopped air in position is dependent on how often the opponent checks and how often he check folds once he checks. The EV of betting air is dependent on how often the opponent check folds once he checks. So these are both pretty simple, but let's make sure we understand them. If we just get to see a flop in position, we care about two things when we flop garbage. How profitable is our bluff? And how often do we get to make that bluff? So that's what determines how much our EV is worth immediately on the flop before we know what our opponent does. How often does he check? And once he checks, how often does he check fold? That's different from just looking at the value of our bet once our opponent did check. Once our opponent did check, now all we care about is how much does he check fold once he checks, and that will give us an idea for the EV of our air, once we bet it, because we already know our opponent's checked at that point. So just understand the difference. Example of calculations. Do the math for these before you look at the answer. This series is going to be way too difficult if you cannot do the math and are making no effort to fix that. Example number 1. I am in the cutoff and you are in the button, so we're throwing down. I open at 3 big blinds, you flat, and both the blinds fold. I checked you 50% of the time and check fold 55% of the time if you bet 6 big blind into a 7.5 big blind pot. What is the EV of betting a 0% equity hand after I check to you? So remember, I checked to you half the time, but this time I've already checked to you, and once I do check, you're going to win the hand 55% of the time when I check fold and lose 45%. What is the EV of that? Well, 55% of the time you win 7.5 big blinds because I check folded, and then 45% of the time you lose 6 big blinds because I check called or check raised. Overall, your EV of betting air is 1.425 big blinds once I check to you. That's a good chunk of EV right there. So if you do flop a complete garbage hand, you are really rooting for me to check, because if I bet, you have to just insta-muck, whereas if I check, you still get this money back, which is nice. It's nice to win 1.4 BBs in EV, getting to bet a complete garbage hand. Question number 2. What is the EV of flopping pure air on this flop? So we already know what the pure air is worth once I check. It's 1.425 big blinds. So what is the overall EV of flopping pure air? Because in question number 1, I had already checked. Here I haven't already checked, so what's the EV? Pause for a moment and think. Well, that's just the frequency you get a bet times the EV of the bet. So you make 1.425 BBs every time you get a bet, and you get a bet half the time, so the average is 0.125 BB. Question number 3. What do you expect to net overall for the hand immediately after you flop air? So we just learned in question number 2 that even when you flop air, even if you have 0% equity, you actually still expect to win some money from the pot. When that happens, though, what's your overall EV from the hand? Not your overall EV from that point, but the overall EV for the hand. Write it out. Well, since you've lost 3 big blinds as dead money already, and then you get 0.7125 big blinds back, your EV on average is negative 2.2875. I'm going to go ninja edit right now. So I guess it's not quite a ninja edit if I say I'm going to do it. That's one of those sort of catch-22 oxymoron, whatever the hell type of deals. But either way, don't forget your signs. On average, you're expecting to lose 2.2875 big blinds when you flop a garbage hand. So it's interesting to note, even if your equity is 0 here, your EV is not 0 on the flop. You expect to get some money. You expect to win some money back. But you're still overall going to be losing a good chunk on the hand. So don't call with crap hands against me, because even though you do get to make a profitable bet pretty often, you're still overall going to pretty much get owned doing that. Analysis of calculations. How does calling with a crap hand preflop look here? Does it look highly profitable just because you can bet any 2 cards once I check? We've already beaten this dead horse. No, it does not look profitable. Pause for a moment and give me reasons why calling with weak hands here still won't be profitable. This I have not given you all the answers for yet. When you're trying to make equilibrium points or Nash equilibriums in difficult situations, you need to be able to take into account a whole lot of variables, some of which I haven't talked about right now. So pause for a moment and think, what have I not mentioned that's still really important that says, just because I'm in the cutoff and I'm checking decently often and check folding decently often, still says you can't flat the button with crap hands. There's some other things I haven't mentioned yet. Let's go through them. Number 1, you still lose on average 2.2875 BB when you flop a garbage hand. We've talked about that. Weak hands flop garbage hands at a high frequency. That's pretty obvious. So you're going to be losing that 2.2875 big blinds pretty often because, weak hands don't flop well. That's why they're called weak hands. Number 3, since I only c-bet 50% and check fold 55% once I do check, when you do flop, well, you usually get paid less. We have not talked about that yet, but that's a really important thing to keep in mind. Think about this. You might think, whoa, this math shows when I flop pocket pairs, I can make profitable bluffs on most boards. I didn't know that because I always thought pocket pairs sucked and I couldn't bluff them. But you also need to think, then again, it also shows my opponent betting less, so I'll get paid a lot less when I hit. So, just because you can bluff pretty profitably pretty often against me doesn't mean you can start flatting me with weaker hands necessarily, because now when some of these weak hands do hit, so it could be like a pocket pair that should be folded. It might not necessarily be a cutoff versus button situation, but maybe it's a pocket pair that should be folded in theory, or an ace-x suited that should be folded in theory. Sometimes those hands are going to flop really, really good hands, and now you're getting paid less from me than you probably are against someone who's c-betting like 85%. I'm just not betting all that often on the flop, so when you do flop great, you're not going to get paid as much. So remember, just because a hand can make a profitable bluff, that's only half the story. You also have to think, how much are you going to get paid when you actually do hit? And number 4, weak hands are vulnerable to being squeezed here from the big blind, and you insta-lose 3 big blinds when that happens when you called with a very weak hand pre-flop. So I'm pretty much protected on the cutoff from you flatting super, super wide on the button because you're going to get squeezed if you do it too much. That's important to remember that that's going to affect where Nash equilibriums lie, because now you might think, oh, well, I can call wide because Matt's check folding a lot and it makes some of these hands like ace-x suited good. Yeah, but if you start calling with those, you're going to get squeezed, and then sometimes you just instantly lose the 3 big blinds. That's a lot. So keep all that in mind. These values are extremely significant for finding equilibriums. These values are probably the most important starting point for analyzing hands out of position. At least one of the major starting points. There are a lot of things which need to be analyzed at once, but these are a really, really big deal. These values help determine what frequency your opponent will bet. If your opponent expects to win a lot when he bets any 2 cards on the flop, he is likely to cash in more hands now by betting them. What do I mean by that? For example, if you check fold 60%, he'll probably bet more than if you check fold 45%. If you check fold 60%, then your opponent wins at least 2.4 BB on average when he bets 0.75 pot size bets into an 8 BB pot. A hand must now be more than 2.4 BB in EV when checking. So let's pause for a moment and make sure we don't make this any more complicated than it is, because this is actually pretty simple. If I check to you, if I'm playing against you and I'm out of position and you're in position, and I check to you, you're going to bet when betting is more profitable than checking, and you're going to check when checking is more profitable than betting. If I'm check folding a ton, that makes betting really, really profitable with any 2 cards in your hand. So if I'm check folding a ton, it's going to be hard to find hands where checking is more profitable than betting because you already know betting is so incredibly profitable. If I'm check defending a ton, then it's not going to be that hard to find hands where checking is more profitable than betting, because when you do bet, you only expect to have a very slightly profitable bluff. So it's going to be easy to find hands that are better to check back than they are to bet. So when I decide how often I'm defending my checks, that is going to have a huge impact on how often you're betting in a position or how often you're checking back. This has a significant effect on how we should design our ranges, both in and out of position. We'll talk about this in more detail in future videos. It is hard to overemphasize how important these values are for helping us find equilibriums. If I can predict how often you're going to bet once I check to you, that will tell me, does check raising make sense with my strong hands? Does check calling make sense with my strong hands? Are you checking back a ton so I should be betting with my strong hands? And all that will be extremely important for helping us to find equilibriums. So it is hard to overemphasize just how important it is to figure out how profitable is it once you check out of position and your opponent gets to bet. So let's start off with a very easy example. We're going to get into much more difficult hands later on in the series. Imagine you flat a cutoff open in the big blind and the flop comes 6 of clubs, 4 of hearts, 4 of spades. How profitable should your opponent's flop bets likely be? So you're in the big blind against a cutoff open. How profitable should it be once you check to him and he bets? Very profitable. Position is very useful on this board and his range is stronger than ours. we're likely going to get crushed defending 60% plus here. So remember, we were in the big blind, so we got a big discount on our call. We got a board which misses our range. We got a board which is pretty useful to be in position on because the turn and river are going to change who has the best hand a lot. This is a spot where we're just not defending 60%. We'll get absolutely slaughtered if we even come close to trying. So, very profitable bluffs for our opponent here. Are profitable bluffs for our opponent a problem for us here? No, he's a luck sack for getting a 6-high flop. We can only have 4 nutted combos, and position is quite valuable here. Run harder. So we're not freaking out just because he can bet any 2 cards. Everything seems reasonable. He got a lucky flop. It happens. Does this mean our opponent bets his entire range on the flop? Well, we just said our opponent can profitably bet any 2 cards. So does this mean he's betting his entire range on the flop? No. He checks when checking is more profitable than betting. Just because betting is profitable does not mean checking isn't more profitable. Keep that in mind. That's such an important thing to take home. Just because your opponent can profitably bet any 2 cards doesn't mean he bets his entire range. He still might have hands where checking's more profitable than betting. Explain why donk betting is awful here. Okay, so why would we never donk bet on this board? Well, the EV of a bluff with any 2 cards is very high for the opponent. This makes it harder for checking to be more profitable than betting for our opponent. This is especially true since hands which may check back well here, such as ace, queen, and friends, also bluff well. So think about it here. If you're in the cutoff and you're playing against the big blind, what hands are you checking back on this flop? Probably almost nothing, if not literally nothing. We can't prove you should bet any 2 cards on this flop. Or we can't prove you should bet your entire range on this flop, but it looks pretty reasonable. In fact, if I had to guess, this is probably one of the few spots where you should be betting almost your entire range, if not literally your entire range on the flop. Number 2, our check call or check raise when we're in the big blind will now succeed at a very high frequency. This makes check calling or check raising more plus EV. So if we know our opponent's pretty much always going to bet once we check to him, why would we bet ourselves, which gives them an opportunity to fold, and doesn't let us put in a check raise if we choose to put in a check raise on the flop? So it doesn't make any sense to ever donk bet here, because we would always want to check raise with any hand that's strong enough to be putting money into the pot. When we donk bet a hand like pocket 10s or pocket jacks, people might think that's a reasonable donk betting hand. It's really not strong enough to donk bet here. So the only hands that are strong enough to donk bet are going to be pocket 6s and pocket 4s. And those hands are so rare that our opponent's going to be betting the flop so much that we're never going to want to donk bet them. More on equilibriums. As you'll see in future videos, we are forced to try to find solutions by constantly having each player adjust. This is especially true on the flop. For example, we use models to give us a starting point for player A's range and player B's range. We then find a way to improve player A's range by looking at player B's range. We then improve player B's range against player A's new range. We then improve player A's range against player B's new range. We keep going back and forth, improving each player's range until we finally reach a point where we're just like, this looks as close to equilibrium as we can get. I don't see a way to improve either player's range. This is how most games are solved in the real world. Poker, fortunately, is so complicated that you can't just tell a computer, run the simulation and find the solution, so we're stuck using models as a starting point than doing things manually. So keep that in mind. In the real world, you are actually usually solving games this way. You keep adjusting each player back and forth to each player's strategy until you reach as close to equilibrium as you can get, and you use a computer to make that adjustment happen millions of times. The better we get at theory, the better we'll be at getting a really good starting point when trying to solve a hand. We'll know about how many value bets to bluffs we'll need. We'll know how many checks we need to defend. We'll understand when more emphasis should be placed on check calling or check raising. So since we can't just have a computer adjust each player's range back and forth a billion times, since there's so many variables, so many different turn cards, so many different river cards, where the computer would need too much input, the best we can do is use theory to get a really, really good starting point and then adjust each player's range manually. Think about it. If you're trying to solve an incredibly complex spot, if you're trying to solve a button versus big blind spot, and you have no reasonable starting point, you're not even going to be able to get anywhere close near to what looks like a Nash equilibrium where neither player has an incentive to change. But if you understand theory really well, and you have a good grasp of about how many flops you need to, or about how many flop checks you need to defend, or what boards are better to check raise, what boards are better to check call, about what ratio of check raise bluffs to value check raises you need, about what ratio of value bets to bluffs you need if you donk bet the flop. Once you have all those sort of ratios kind of established with models, you can use all that information, and now when you're trying to solve a hand, you've got a really good starting point. So you're still going to need to adjust back and forth a few times, and every time you adjust back and forth, you're going to get closer and closer, but now you have a really good starting point where you can be like, okay, this is good enough. I understand what's happening. I understand what hands are close. So when I'm actually playing, I'll know what to do. And if I do want to get more and more precise, I'll understand how I can spend the time to do that. So theory is super, super important for out of position flop play, but it is not going to give you this crystal clear, crisp answer like you'll sometimes get in other spots which are much more simple. End of the video. I hope you enjoyed the video. I know most people don't watch this for entertainment purposes, but hopefully you found it somewhat interesting and enlightening while you learned. I imagine you have a lot of unanswered questions right now, which is understandable. We have a lot more to do. It's very hard to look at one concept in isolation when analyzing out-of-position play, but we have to start somewhere. Many of your questions will probably be answered and concepts will click as you watch other videos. This series might be a good idea to watch twice, as you'll see how more things fit together after being introduced to everything. So this is one of those concepts where it's really hard to start explaining anything at first, but once I've explained more and more things, everything will start clicking and coming together. So if you watch this video again after you've watched the whole series, you'll probably be like, oh, I get why Matt said something that way. Or, oh, I get why he's doing this on the flop, even though he hadn't addressed that concept by now. So maybe watch this video again after you've watched the whole series if you think it'll be worth your time. And feel free to leave comments and ask questions in the forums, but I am not going to discuss concepts which will be discussed in future videos. So there's a lot of concepts that we still have to do that I just haven't even touched yet. So even though a lot of people probably are wondering about those concepts, I'm probably not going to address them in any sort of detail in the forums. I'm going to wait for the appropriate video for that. So thanks for watching, everyone. Good luck at the tables. I'll see you guys soon. Bye.